So we thought very long and hard about who to invite here. And the criteria were really people who could synthesize what they've been hearing in this room and who could offer you an interesting perspective. So 3 of our speakers have a bit of a history with NCEAS, and 1 has absolutely none. The first one is Eric Stockstad, who works with science. And Eric has had a number of dealings with you, everything from writing pieces about NCEAS. One of my favorites was Detente in the Fish Wars, which was about Ray Hilborn and Boris Worm forming an NCEAS working group to get a closer approximation of the state of global fisheries. Ray, you're here somewhere. I actually consider one of my greatest achievements ever in life was getting 22 scientists in that group to agree on common messages. And they worked really hard at it, and they negotiated what they were going to say, and they stuck to it. And so what happened was amazing. This consistency of messages all around the world from each of the people, no matter where they were, in Australia, in the US, in the UK, and it was the hard work that went into it. Okay, and Eric has also done workshops. He worked with the Salmon Group, and he worked with Ecosystem-Based Management Group, and now he's going to give you a bit of his perspective on what he's been hearing and thinking about. Where do things need to go for NCEAS 2.0? Eric.
Can we swap?
Yeah.
All right, that's my cheat sheet. Okay, so I'm a journalist, so I'm going to start with something that you haven't heard yet and is unexpected, which is I'm going to be brief. So I'm going to start out telling you a little bit about where I work in the media ecosystem, a couple of thoughts on NCEAS. I guess it'll be the first outside perspective on NCEAS today, and then a little bit about what I've heard so far today. So I work for science. I did not reject your paper. That happens on the 10th floor, and I work on the 11th floor. And as someone here already mentioned about geographic proximity, that's one flight of stairs is a huge communication barrier. And to be frank, they also are very careful about keeping everything about the peer review process confidential. So it's a little bit of a chimera or a split brain at science, because we have the staff that works on peer-reviewed research, and then almost an equivalent size staff that works for news. And we in the news department are trying to find stories that will intrigue you, entertain you, shock you. News not only about scientific findings, but about the process. So in that sense, we're a little bit of a trade magazine. You really are our audience, so we're trying to find things that will be interesting to you as scientists. And I'll have one brief example a little later about a story from NCEAS that I thought was really cool and hope would be of wide interest. So NCEAS it's a gold mine for journalists, or at least from my perspective. If you think about what it does, which is bring together a collection of great minds, ask them a question that is of broad scientific interest, often has societal implications, and then tell me what it all means. That's a great trove of story ideas. I look at the list of what working groups are doing just to get a sense of what's hot in the field. The story about Boris Worm and Ray Hilborn the working group was a great story device, because it provided a way into a story. It wasn't about the controversy, because that was at that point was already dying away, but it was a nice story about progress, about coming together and doing all the things that you've heard already today that NCEAS does. Another favorite example is about the nutrient network. And what really I thought was great about that was a story that didn't end with a working group, it began with a working group. and a bunch of scientists who were frustrated at what I'm sure you have all found as a common obstacle, that the data, the way the studies were done is different, so it's hard to put them together. And I don't know what the usual thing is. I assume most of you just suck up and deal with it somehow. But these scientists said, well, you know what, actually, what if we gathered the data ourselves? And what if we did it in a simple way, which is a clever approach. And that's a great story idea. People love clever. And what I was hoping in this was it would be a story that would be of interest not just to ecologists, because I think some of the things that happens at NCEAS stay in ecology because they're fundamental questions to ecology, and that might not be of interest to particle physicists at CERN. But with this approach that they came up with, which is let's take a simple, fast experiment and have it be done by volunteers all over the world, and then pool the data. In the back of my mind when I was writing that story was, maybe that might be of interest to psychologists or sedimentologists. So I guess the point there is NCEAS as a process has been a source of interesting story ideas. So it's really been great to come here and listen to you today. I mean, that's one of the great things about my job is hearing what scientists are thinking and talking with scientists. So it's been a pleasure to be here. Some of the things I've heard, I've been thinking, all right, there are a lot of discussion here about topical areas where NCEAS could go forward, or what would it look like. And in the back of my mind, I was trying to think, what are the general trends here that are relevant to communicating? So if you're gonna come up with an answer, and then you're trying to let people outside your tower know about it, what are we talking about here about the future that might be relevant? And one thing that struck me, I don't think it was said explicitly, but it's that the problems and the questions are just going to get harder. So what do you do to craft a compelling and simple message that's going to communicate in the ever more distracted and fractured media world? When your answer you come up with is, it depends. It depends where you are. It depends what kind of an animal you are. It depends what time of the year you're talking about. So how are you going to do that? And the other thing that I heard was that the data streams are going to become more different. I'll beat it, 2 minutes. The modeling is going to become more complex, right? So how do you, and I don't have an answer for this, how do you explain what you've done when you've put a lot of data into a complicated model with a whole bunch of statistical tests that no one has heard of? How do you explain what you've done? How do you explain it in a way that builds confidence that you've done something that's robust, and your answer is something more than, we put it in a really sophisticated model, trust us, right? So I don't have answers to that. Those are not new problems, right? That the climate science has wrestled with that. So the good news, I think, is that the tools are out there. The resources are out there for communicating these things. Institutions have professionals who can deal with that. There are training organizations, Compass is a great one, that help people craft messages. So you can do it. And the other thing, just a simple point I would say, is that it's the need for synthesis science is only going to get greater. The demand for answers and solutions from scientists is only going to get greater. So what you're doing is really important. Keep it up.
Thanks. Next up is Michael Todd. Michael, you can move up there and I'll just tell him what
No, I just want to stay seated. It gives me plausible deniability when my time is up. Oh, okay, never mind. Jump on.
So Michael has quite a long history with NCEAS and has done a lot for many scientists. He not only can help you tell your stories by having reporters tell them, he also works with scientists to write your own stories. And there have been some remarkable examples of that, of people from NCEAS working groups. He also, for those of you who are Leopold Fellows, there's at least Ted Schur and Leah Gerber had Michael as a trainer at the Aldo Vehicle Leadership Program, where we've also collaborated. So take it away, Michael.
Give you just to kind of continue this ecosystem analogy that's gone in with the mass extinctions that have gone on in the mainstream media. There's been some new things that have risen up, and one of them is Miller McCune, aka Pacific Standard, the people who brought you your wine and beer last night. So I will gladly pander to whatever it takes to get your enthusiasm behind this. Miller McCune started about 4 years ago. Our DNA actually lies in Sage Publications, which does an academic publisher in Thousand Oaks, California, which does a lot of behavioral type science stuff. The genesis of this was the founder of Sage Publications and Miller McCune and Sarah Miller McCune, who saw a lot of good material that was out there, good scientific things that really should have been influencing the policy debate, that should have been influencing the kitchen table debate, that should have been influencing every debate, was it went into journals, and then it went right into the memory hole, and that was as far as it ever went. And her goal was to make sure that this got out there. So we started again about 4 years ago. I run the website, and we also, again, we have the print magazine. One of the things that we do in working with scientists is that we're interested in database, data-rich and evidence-rich material. So we really are interested in trying to take that at that early level and put it out there in a journalistic way. And one of the things that I'm going to encourage you to do is to become, we heard about citizen scientists earlier, I'm going to ask you to become citizen journalists. And what we are trying to do, we're trying to get you to write for yourself. I know you write for an academic audience already, and that's great, but what goes on in the academy stays in the academy. What we're interested in doing is trying to push you to go that next step into putting it out in public. And I heard the word impact a little bit ago, not just when Nancy used it, but the idea that what you do has impact. Not impact factor, not the impact factor, not what journal you're in or something like that, but that has impact. That the work you do, and again, if you're interested in advocacy or being an advocate, and again, I know we should define our terms, but independent of that, the idea that you can take what you're doing and actually put it out there in the agora, in the marketplace, and get some results, and see some policy direction, something like this is the sort of thing that we're interested in doing. That's what we're interested in working with you, having you write for us, having us interview you. And when I say us, I'm talking about a lot more people than just Miller McCune, by the way. But this is our particular niche in this particular ecosystem. But the idea that we can do that, or that we can just encourage you to be part of a mainstream magazine, newspaper, public television, nightly newscast type article. The idea is that we want you to be involved in that and do it yourself. And the first thought I know that tends to come up, it's like, yeah, Christ, have you seen my schedule? There's no way I'm going to fit this in. I'm not asking every person to do everything. It's like earlier in the day we were talking about doing things that were multidisciplinary, and it was like, well, but won't that create some roadblocks? Well, it does if everyone links arms and tries to go through the door simultaneously. But the idea is that you can do this, you can find your sweet spot, you can find what it is in this journalistic media universe where you can actually contribute something, and you can do that. So if you're not comfortable, if you don't want to tweet, that's fine. Here I come, I'm here, I'm talking to you about doing all this stuff. I'm not live tweeting this. That's not where my sweet spot is. And I'm not going to pretend that that's my sweet spot. But I will encourage you to try it. I didn't put this on Facebook. We will blog about this. We will write some things up about it. And I will do that. I'll practice to an extent what I preach, but I'm not expecting you to do everything. I'm not expecting you to do everything that comes up today. Jai will talk a little bit. He's gone through the Miller McCune Academy, if you will, on what you can do as a scientist. One of the beauties, too, of Miller McCune and other websites and other things of our ilk that are not the New York Times, that are not science, is we can act as a testing pad or a sandbox for what you're doing. That you can actually try out some things. You can kind of stretch your muscles a little bit. You can try some things. You can move forward. You can write something. We will work with you. I can interview you, or others of our journalists can interview you. It's something that you can do. It has a limited reach. It's a powerful reach, and I don't mean to diminish what my organization does, but it's a good way to just kind of like put your toe in the water and go, I can do this. I can do this. there are prices to doing this though, and beyond time. And I realize time is the killer, and it's the convenient answer. We never can find time for things we don't want to do, oddly enough. But we often are able to find time for things we do want to do, which I've never been able to quite figure that one out. But I know time is the default position. We can't do that. But the other thing is I want to go out there and like not everyone stood up when they said, do they like talking to journalists? And I don't blame you, because it's tough, and there are ugly incidents that I know all of you know, if you haven't experienced firsthand, that you've experienced other ways. But in order to put your message out there, to get your message and to have it get some traction, to have some impact, then I think you have to take some responsibility for it yourself, which again, is not necessarily the message that you want to hear. And you have to have some personal traits that you may or may not have at this point. I was talking to David Bowman just a little bit ago, and he's talked to a lot of media after an op-ed he had in Nature. One of the things he said is you have to be titanium tough. And it's like, that's not a message I want to hear. I want to hear that it's great and it's wonderful and that people are going to throw daisies in front of me as I'm walking down the street. And I also want to know that my peers are going to come and they're going to flock me and they're going to pat me in the back and do a good job, instead of either telling me, either pointing out where I made the mistakes, or possibly where I was misquoted, or where I was miscontexted, or something like that. Or God forbid, if I did a good job, then the tall poppy syndrome comes in, and it's just like, oh, you're trying to make yourself a public intellectual, are you? It's like, oh, we got ways of dealing with that. You have to make a conscious decision when you do this. But the fact that you're here, the fact that you've gone through NCEAS, which has this huge, tremendous, awesome communications component, and the fact that you're sitting here and you haven't all started looking at your email or gone off to the bathroom already, I mean, tells me that this is something that you're willing to do, and it's something that you're at least interested in entertaining the notion of going that next step.
Michael, why don't you introduce Jai? I think that would be quite fitting. I'll just kick it off by saying, if you don't know Jai, he's a force of nature.
Well, Jai has laryngitis, so those of you who don't know Jai, you're only getting, you're getting cheated. This is like a movie teaser here, and it's like, you're only going to get the best part, because you need to see the whole 2-hour James Cameron in 3D version of Jai at some point. I met Jai at a training for NCEAS, and we were all kind of like falling asleep, like you are now, and all of a sudden this ball of fire stood up and said something that was inane. I guarantee it was inane, but it came up and really kind of set the room on fire. And in the back of my mind, it's like, now there's a guy who might be able to talk for himself at some point. So we ultimately brought Jai on, and he did a podcast for us for about 10 months called Curiouser and Curiouser. He was a victim of budget cuts, unfortunately. Doing a podcast, by the way, I talk about doing these things, such as a podcast, and I said, don't use time as your default problem. But when you start doing a podcast, then it becomes a legitimate, it's a huge time suck. But Jai, what he would do is he would talk to people that came through NCEAS, which is kind of a candy store to journalists, to science-oriented journalists, and would talk to them and do these tremendous one-on-one podcasts with various people. And it was his one on deciphering the fury on the post-Fukushima, was that nuclear or was it tectonic? On the tectonic aspects of the Japanese quake, has been in our top 10 most viewed items, even though it's 15 minutes of time when you listen to it. It's been in there ever since day one. Anyway.
All right. Hello, everybody. And I apologize in advance for my laryngitis. I'm getting my Kathleen Turner sexy voice on because it's ecology. It's a sexy subject. Gotta do it. Okay. Let's talk about, we talked a bit about NCEAS 2.0, and maybe what communication 2.0, what's that going to be? And maybe to do that, we can talk about what is synthesis about. And what I've heard time and time today was stories of scientists really engaging with other scientists. And that didn't just change the science, it changed them. They were personally transformed by the experience of reaching out to people who were different. And that's what Communication 2.0 is all about. So maybe we can talk a bit about Communication 1.0 is for science. And I don't mean to put this down in any way, but more to say this is kind of what it's about. And I would shorten it to say, science communication today is basically we talk to the king. Meaning, we're going to find the policymakers, the people who are actually setting policy, and we're going to try to advise them, influence them to change what they're doing. And that's a very valuable thing to do. I'm not putting it down in any way. It has a very old tradition going back hundreds and hundreds of years. But at a time when, I mean, if you look at the polling of people's concern about the environment, it's just falling off a cliff. You know, particularly if you look at young people, just talking to the current policymakers, whether they're in corporations, business, it doesn't really matter where, that's not going to be enough, although it is very important. So what is that thing to do? What if, imagine the future, what if every scientist had a fan base? They had 1,000 people who were paying attention to what they said. You know, it doesn't really matter how to talk to these people, through public talks, through blogging, maybe in 20 years it'll be holograms, who knows? But in one way or another, they are engaging the public with their science message. It doesn't have to be advocacy. It could be, hey, you know, here's the important stuff we're doing in our lab that has no policy relevance whatsoever, but I want you to know about it. And these scientists are not just, you know, paying attention to this message. These people are not just paying attention to the scientist's message. Some of them are kicking enough money to pay for some of that research. And now, multiply this not by just one scientist, but by, say, every scientist in this room is reaching 1,000 people directly with their science message. Multiply that by every ecologist, by every scientist. How many people would be directly touched by a science message who are not being touched now? And to me, this is what I think this is the future of science. And you might say, well, you know, this is all pie in the sky. Can this actually happen? It has already happened. Jared Burns and I, in the fall, we ran a little something called the Sci-Fund Challenge, which is using a new internet way of raising money for science. We organized a bunch of scientists, and in the fall, in 1 month, well over 1,000 scientists, well over 1,000 donors from the general public gave over $76,000 to fund direct research. And we didn't know what the heck we were doing, quite frankly. You know? And so we're doing it again, we need more. But the point is that there are tremendous possibilities to reach out to the general public directly, to change minds directly. Yes, working through journalists is very important. Working through policymakers is very important. But what about reaching out directly to them outside? It's something very different from science. But I think that's the future, and there's so many tools to do it, and that's where we need to go.
Thanks, John. Our next speaker is John Rennie. It says in your program that he is the editor-in-chief of Scientific American. He was for 15 years, but he now has transformed and is really an example of somebody who has probably more synthetic prowess than anybody I know. And I brought him in, though he's never been connected to NCEAS before, because I knew that he could really feed back to you some of the things that he's heard today, and perhaps share a vision for what NCEAS 2.0 might be.
Okay, I'm just going to rewrite all my notes. No, thank you very much, and I really appreciate your having me here. As the person with really no connection to NCEAS at all, you've been very nice in having me here, and it honestly has not been at all like crashing your college reunion. So I am really glad to be here, and as Nancy said, yes, I was at Scientific American. I was 15 years, I was the editor-in-chief. I was there actually for 20 years altogether, from 1989 until 2009. And it was a very interesting stretch of time to be there, because during that 20-year block of time, you know, that's when we saw sort of really, certainly within sort of the larger engaged portion of the public, and really a lot of the scientific community, a rise in the concerns of things like biodiversity crises and climate change, and really the issue of sustainability as some kind of rallying cry for a response to some of these kinds of problems. It's also during that same stretch of time that we actually saw the web arise, and then of course start to evolve into something where it could become a kind of collaborative tool for scientists and other people in a way of sharing different sorts of information. And it's even during this stretch of time that we start to see the meta-analysis as a scientific tool itself start to arise. Not least of all, of course, obviously, because of everything that you have been doing at NCEAS within the area of ecology and environment, and applying it to that. So it's probably, I hope it's not too disappointing if I then point out that the degree of the success of some of these things, as far as it gets out to the public, has not all been that outstanding. In that, for example, I'm not really sure that much of the public knows that synthesis science is a thing. I think that, you know, there are people who are aware to a certain sophisticated portion of the public knows that that is an approach that is taken, but I don't think they necessarily recognize that as a sort of discrete, novel approach to making scientific progress. And so it's sad to say that's probably a way in which the accomplishments of something like NCEAS and the people entirely within your field really don't always get appreciated by the public at large. If you feel at all that that's a failure of the media, you're right. Because the media do not follow process very well. They like to report on results. And if it makes you feel better, well, you can recognize that during this same 20 years, a lot of the big conventional media also took it on the chin a lot and have started to fall apart, or been replaced at least by a lot of, you know, old new voices like Pacific Standard and Miller McCune. That fall of conventional media, you know, also does, as has been pointed out, is a great opportunity for the rise of the new sorts of media, which is why the great thing about today is that there are more opportunities for more people to be reaching out and expressing great scientific messages in a variety of rich ways than there ever were before. And that is already happening, and it can happen even more if great people like you get that much more involved. That said, I do want to, at the risk of, you know, I think this falls in the heading of full disclosure, it's important to understand what some of the challenges of that are. And Jai already talked about a wonderful part of the challenge of that, but it's one that in some respects is so natural and so human, which is simply the matter of sharing what your experience is, sharing who you are and what you've done and what you're like has a tremendous inspirational quality to it, more than you realize. It can actually change and affect people's lives. But, I mean, I think, and this goes to what Michael was saying, you know, I don't want to present an overly rosy picture of the challenge that's ahead of you on this. First of all, the level of ignorance in the public cannot be overstated. And I said, I mean that, you know, not judgmentally, but literally in the sense that they simply don't know. Even relatively sophisticated audiences do not know a shocking amount of things that you take for granted. To the level that I'm saying that about even other scientists in other disciplines may be completely unacquainted with basic ideas that you take for granted and that is just common knowledge to you. So let alone the general public. I will tell you for a fact, not a fact I'm proud of, but that a certain stripe of readers of Scientific American, whom you would think would be as sophisticated a group in the general public as you would like, that a certain number of them do not know or believe anything about the science of climate change. They are deeply suspicious of any ideas having to do about biodiversity or any sort of biodiversity crisis, and they, for that matter, don't particularly believe in evolution. So, that's the kind of ignorance you have to be aware that is out there and that you have to engage with at some level. The other big problem is that a lot of these kinds of issues with which you are most concerned is, undeniably, they are very politicized. Now we can go into all sorts of reasons why they have been politicized, but there's really not much question that, you know, fundamentally these things have become landmines when you start to talk about any of these areas of biodiversity and climate change and the like in all the ways that you know. And it's a real challenge, therefore, when you go out to speak on this. Nancy mentioned that I had phrased that question about would you be willing to speak out if you knew that you might be recognized as an advocate, and you feel that that would be inconsistent with your role as a good scientist. And the natural response a lot of you had was, well, define what an advocate is. No, you don't get that definition. You see, that's a label that will be put on you after the fact. What you should really be aware of is that if you speak out, a certain portion of the public, and I mean that just across the board, not just lay public, but even some of your peers and potential reviewers, they will consider you an advocate. So the question is, will you do it anyway because it still needs to be done? And there's a whole other issue that goes to the question of a phenomenon called cultural cognition. Some of you may have heard about that. We can talk about it more in the discussion. But it goes to the whole idea that unlike in the past, a lot of us have simply thought that if we simply exposed people who didn't know enough to the right ideas and the right arguments, they would overcome that. And cultural cognition is a phenomenon that's been coming out of psychology that suggests no, that people basically have their minds made up on a lot of subjects before they ever take in the facts, and in fact, they actively screen out ideas on the basis of who they think is saying them. That's why it's so important to make these kinds of connections, but also to learn how to speak in the language of that. Nancy talked about know your audience. There is no one audience. There is no one message. There is no one right way to do this. You should, in whatever ways that you can possibly engage, do it with whatever frequency you possibly can, because no one approach will work for everybody. But you have to hope that cumulatively all the little attempts that we can all make will actually, in the end, have some sort of beneficial effect.
Questions? Thoughts? And please identify yourself. Bruce.
This is Bruce Kendall. Jai, you mentioned and you pointed out that one of the things that we get out of interdisciplinary collaboration is getting to know the other, someone who's not like us, and that we benefit from that. And you extended that analogy to the, reaching out to non-scientific audiences. But my understanding is that with the fragmentation of media and the rise of social media, that audiences are self-selecting sources that are just like them. And people are only listening to the voices that they want to hear and that they already identify with. Am I off base on that? But more, generally, what do the panelists have to say? Well, if I have a blog, am I actually going to reach anybody except the people who already know about the kind of stuff that I do?
That's a really excellent point, and there is a big issue of self-selection. You're going to get people will you get people who only were going to believe you before you even started writing your thing in the first place? But there is an answer, and the answer is ambassadors, which is communities you're trying to hit, finding people who are legitimate people in those communities, and having them act as like, hey, here's a guy you should listen to. It's no different than any social thing. If you're trying to break into a group of academics you like to help, you want to help with your project, you find somebody who can sort of make the inroads. Like, this is a legitimate person. It works exactly the same way. So it is absolutely right. It takes extra work to break into new communities, but it can be done. It's being done every day.
For whatever it's worth, I know that, that is, as both of you have said, it's a very real concern, that issue that you're already preaching to the choir. But there has been at least one study that has come out that had suggested that even in the age of new media, that issue of siloization of voices, that is happening less than people thought, no more so than in the past. That in fact, potentially in some cases, people may actually be exposed to more different points of view than they did in the past.
Yeah. Yes.
Lee Waldaver, I'd like to build a bridge between Mike Todd and the last issue of Miller McCune and what Mr. Rennie was talking about, and maybe Mike could talk about it. There's an article all the way in the back. It's a review of a book by Tom Jacobs, and I think the headline is "Why Morals Are More Important Than Your Morals." And it's about a book talking about 6 different groupings of how people organize themselves and how they share collective values. And next week at this time, I'm going to be in New York for business and DC for policy, and I'm going to be dealing with that in spades, because it'll be like Bernard Shaw said about United States and England, 2 great countries separated only by a common language, because we'll be saying the same thing to everybody, but the things that they'll be picking up and the way their minds will organize it will be based on the value assumptions that undermine their job or their religion or their academic training, which gets back to what Mike and Mr. Rennie was saying about even when you get the information out there, depending where it goes and how it's formatted, most people either won't see it or won't understand it or won't accept it. So I was wondering maybe if Mises is the last print issue of Miller McCune might reference that article.
The piece is based on the work of Jonathan Haidt, and I can't remember if he's a sociologist or a psychologist. I don't think he's had anything to do with NCEAS. But he's basically taken all the value sets of everyone for left, right in the U.S. or you know, liberal Christian Democrat, et cetera, in various countries. The idea being that the way I approach things are different from the way you approach things. And where I think this comes in valuable here is that your argument that's going to work on your seatmate is not going to work on the person that you meet on the sidewalk necessarily. I mean, the idea is that you need to understand what is of value to them and craft your message that way. And again, it kind of goes back to this diversity of media, this diversity of viewpoints, and not that one knockout blow, that one paper that just so perfectly crystallizes and summarizes your life's work only works on a very small subset. And in order to have any impact, again, if you're interested in that you have to come up with various iterations of that. Basically, you have to, if you're a car maker, you have to have an SUV, and you have to have a small car, and you have to have a sedan, and you have to have all these things for your message to get as much traction as possible. And what does that mean? It means, yes, it's a lot more work. But unfortunately, it's necessary.
Mark and I here. I think
Where are you from?
now Toronto. So I think it's in an optimal world, like Jai says, we'd each be talking to 1,000 people, have 1,000 fans, and they're listening to us. But I think that might scare a lot of people in this room, or scare a lot of scientists, the idea that they're just talking to a bunch of people in the public anonymously, and that somehow have to be able to communicate effectively what they're doing to people who may not understand all the technical aspects. And so I would actually suggest that it's much more complex than a communication route. And so, for example, I run a blog.
A super awesome blog.
But I'm not writing for the general public. It's very technical. What the point is that it's synthesizing many of the recent papers that are out there that even us in this room can't read all the papers that are out there, but it's at least presenting some of the most interesting papers. A subset of us think that's interesting. But I know that other people are reading it. And the people that are reading it are people like Ed Yong at Not Exactly Rocket Science, who has a science blog that's read by hundreds of thousands of people as opposed to my tens of thousands. And so he's the type of person I'm trying to get to. And through him and other people, that's how our story and our information is getting out there. And so I think it's a little bit scary to try to think like, I could be like Jai, which none of us can do. And so we don't have that ability to necessarily talk to those thousands of lay people, but instead if we're trying just to communicate amongst each other, amongst those people that can transcend those technical barriers, and that's the effective communication, I think.
Well, if I could just touch on that. So I think this sort of ties on a point that's been raised before, which is that you go to what you're comfortable with. I completely agree. The key thing is to be out there, and whatever way you feel most comfortable is the way to do it. If you're comfortable writing for other ecologists, yes. If you want to start trying to reach the general public, even better. What I have noticed is that there's a lot of people who thought they would never be able to. They were frightened or scared and didn't want to do it, who didn't want to engage with regular people, whoever that is. But once they got started, they got really excited by doing it.
And I just want to say that at the Leopold Leadership Program, where I also teach, we talk a lot about the discomfort zone. And that when you go to that edge, that's where you learn. And the more you push it, the more you keep moving that needle. So it's just, what is your next step is the question. Joan. Over here. Thanks. Oh, did I kind of motion? Over you next. Sorry about that.
Yeah, there we go. I'm still Joan Ruffgard. So I've had a lot of experience, not so much in recent times, not so much about global change or ecology issues, but about evolution. And one of the things that comes up there a lot is that there are really 2 points. One is whether we, speaking as scientists from a forum such as NCEAS, could be regarded as neutral enough. And a lot of people that I encounter view scientists inherently as stakeholders, basically at the trough of government handouts. And so it's important, I think, on the one hand, to go to a forum in which we're invited along with others. And then secondly, about evolution in particular, because of all the polls recently have been showing that the general public wants to hear both sides. And I assume this would also be true for climate change. They want to hear both sides. And we're often conflicted on that because we don't think there is, in some sense, another side. But there is, and it has to be prepared. And I think, and another complication with respect to evolution is that the court cases have made it impossible to talk about the other side in science courses in publicly funded situations. And so the general public, therefore, is frustrated in not being able to access both points of view as to whether evolution occurs or not. And the resolution to that, I think, has come from the so-called Clergy Letter Project, which every February over the weekend sponsors a discussion about evolution in the churches and synagogues around the country. And now this has gotten to 12,000 or more parishes that have signed on to this, and I've participated in that. And so it gets back to my point that if you find yourself talking about evolution actually as after having been invited to do so in a church or synagogue, you're on very neutral turf there. And so I think that's something we need to take into account, is making sure that we do address the need to present both sides of any one of the issues, even if we don't necessarily have a lot of respect for the other side, but we have to do it fairly, and then also try to find an even more neutral place than NCEAS itself might be.
Thank you.
I might suggest that there are some terms that you use that alone are considered not neutral, not just on evolution, but you're ecologists. Okay, you're all leftists. I mean, that's a real simple bit of calculus for a lot of people. Environment. Well, if you're in favor of the environment, and I don't know when this actually occurred, but at some point when you became in favor of environment, that became a political statement. Climate change, as you all know, is a political statement now. My publication is considered left-leaning, even though we're not moderate, we don't lean anyway, we're all over the map. But because we acknowledge a couple weird things, we acknowledge that there's climate change, we acknowledge that there is a residual history of racism, there's a couple other things that are pretty much definable, certifiable facts. We can talk about the specifics of them, but they're not. But anyway, so when you talk about that evolution, a lot of these understand that in the current climate, at least in the United States, it just you've already framed yourself out of a lot of conversations.
Yeah.
I'm Sandy Leopold, and I wanted to just raise one issue that maybe hasn't been addressed, which is that I work for the U.S. government, I work for the U.S. Forest Service, and there's a trend that I've seen in the last several years, which federal scientists, at least in my agency, are essentially forbidden to communicate with journalists. And these are, especially with sort of issues that are politically charged, that we're supposed to forward all inquiries to public affairs agents, people, because there's fear at higher levels that they're not in control of the message from the federal government. And so I'm just curious, as a scientist, what do you suggest any of us do about that?
One thing I'll say about this, there's a term for this in Canada, they call it muzzlegate. I'm actually going next week to do a workshop with a bunch of environmental, government scientists, and the media are all over me. Like, why are you teaching them to communicate if they're not allowed to communicate? I think that Jane I wish Jane were here, because this is something she's been working at very hard, and she actually has instituted a policy within NOAA that allows NOAA employees to express their opinions as citizens while acknowledging it's not the view of the administration. And it's, I think, as yet imperfect, but she's definitely trying to change that system from within.
I mean, ultimately, if the job forbids you to speak to the public, there's nothing you can immediately and directly do about that, except for, by whatever avenues are available to you internally to try to find, some ways of pressing back to try to convince people to change that, or come up with other sort of vehicles and say, well, that's fine, but people are asking about this, so we need to prepare an official statement that will respond to this, so that you at least have something to point to in place. Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody here is looking for everybody who is in your situation to necessarily martyr themselves and say, I'm talking out against the map.
Yeah.
Victoria Sork, UCLA. This has been a very, very good discussion. I want to address a question to John Rennie as sort of the outsider, and he alluded to this in one of his comments and kind of extends some issues that Joan just brought up. It seems to me, if throughout my career, there's never been more emphasis on communication and translation of what our science does and getting it to the public. And yet, the percentage of individuals of the public who understand the concept of evolution and why it's the major thing of biology, or understand the preponderance of evidence supporting that anthropogenic climate change is altering ecosystems, the numbers actually are going down. They're going. So it's almost like ignorance is growing, and we're trying harder. Somebody is ceasing it. I would like to have an analysis of. So telling us to talk more, I actually would say maybe we should quiet up. We were doing better 30 years ago when we didn't try to. Could you comment on this and say what would be the strategy that would work?
Sure. Well, this goes back. The reason that a lot of the people who are, for example, who are most embracing this idea of cultural cognition will say the problem is that the reason why this seems like a paradox is because we are still falling into this idea that there is an information deficit in the public. That if we just keep telling them enough of the right ideas, they will get it. Their argument is no. That the problem is that as soon as people in this room start to talk about these things, as soon as the scientists with their DNA and their molecules start to talk about these things, that it basically is already, it's seen as contradictory to a lot of other values that at some level they hold closely. Now, these are not necessarily just the ideas that they hate science. I mean, I think that's another thing that's very important, is a lot of the people who are on that side, they believe they are all for science. They just believe this is bad science. The way that a lot of the cultural cognition people will talk about this is they say what you need to find are the kinds of ambassadors. That you need to find the people who seemingly are at odds with the stereotype of the tree-hugging ecologist or the inhuman white lab-coated scientist. You need to find that really friendly NASCAR driver, or Taylor Swift, or you need to find people who are coming from a group that shares that set of values. Now, I will say that I mean, I think there's a lot of psychological evidence that really suggests this is they're probably right about a lot of this. Where I part company with some of them is I think it's very easy for some of them to fall into an attitude where implicitly they're saying, there's no hope in even saying this anymore. Let's not even bother keep on trying to get the correct information out there. And I think that's wrong. I think also that quite frankly, a lot of the progress or lack of progress on these issues is not directly a result of the public having failed to get on board with this as much as it is, for example, certain key legislators whom I just can't give the excuse of cultural cognition to. But that's my opinion.
Okay.
It's not represent the administration.
Hands up if you want to see John do an impression of Stephen Colbert.
Josh.
brief comment on that. I also think,
Who,
Josh Tewksbury, I'm from the University of Washington. I think that the one other thing that sort of speaks to your comment, Victoria, is at least in the climate change debates, there's also a lot of things that are outside of our control, like the finite pool of worry, which seems to be lifting slightly as the economy increases, and with that increase we see, upturns in people's recognition of climate change impacts. That combined with sort of the other things that are beyond our control, which are the great talking points that are continually being given to us by climate change. So I'm a bit more hopeful than others that trend is actually moving in the right direction, and it's not. And part of it is because we're getting better at messaging in the climate community, and another part of it is because people have a bit more room to think about it.
So just to follow up on those 2 points, I think a key thing with all of this is that it's not so much presenting new factual arguments to people, because I don't think that works for most of the time. What does work is being part of a social circle, and you as a trusted person saying, hey, I believe this. I may not necessarily know about your argument, but I know about you, and I trust you. So the fact that you say this, that means something to me. And so let's say you're part of my Twitter following, or I go to one of your talks, or whatever. It's more about having a person who's credible saying something rather than anything particular that they're saying.
Yeah, and if I can kind of go back to Mark's blog that he was talking about with his tens of thousands, and then Ed Young with his hundreds of thousands. One of the things that we're seeing in the siloization of news, this idea that I'm only going to read the things that I like, what actually is happening in a lot of cases is I'm really only going to read the things that my friends like. And so if you can do that, if you can extend your own social network, and not necessarily through Facebook, although that's a lovely way, or Google Plus or anything like that, but you yourself is just a human being, and not necessarily someone with pen in hand or anything like that, but just in the grocery checkout line or something else like that, or just in what you talk to your family and say like, oh, it's not going to be another one of those Thanksgivings. If you actually become that ambassador in a small way, so that then somebody else's Facebook picks that up and says, oh, look what Uncle Jake has moving forward, that actually does matter, and that will show an effect, although it may be hard to measure, I'm afraid.
yeah, yes.
Lou Gross, Nimbus. There's another aspect of communication that I think a very large fraction of us in this room do, and that's education. And obviously we have failed, at least those of us who are, I'll call myself vintage, have not been successful at educating our former students about what science is. And happily, there are many new methods that there are many reports that people probably have seen, the Vision and Change report and others, that encourage us to communicate science to our students so that they actually understand what evidence-based science is about. And I would encourage that all of us think about that aspect of communication, and perhaps things will improve, but it'll take a while.
So I don't want to keep you from your drinks, and all these folks are going to be around so you can continue the conversation. I want to give Frank a minute or two just to make some final wrap remarks, but I just really want to think about the idea of NCEAS 2.0 being scientists who are creating a culture of engagement in whichever way works for you, and to explore that. In my 11 years now of working with scientists, what I've seen is that the best communicators are not those who were born with a silver tongue. It's those who work at it the hardest. And so, what I have seen time and time again is that it's simply a lifelong undertaking to up your game. So please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.